after Nixon ended any link to the gold standard in his speech on August 15th, 1971, Earl Butts was kind of like his blunt object to transform the food supply. So up until that point, there weren't a lot of books on what humans should eat. Somehow humans just kind of knew what to eat. You know, we weren't constantly discussing it. We weren't, you know, having 50,000 different podcasts examining what the proper diet is. Kind of like a lion, you just sort of knew you ate meat, you ate animal products, you ate fruit if you know you couldn't find anything else or it was available and in season, which was rare. That seemed to be the way people did it for many, 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 many years. But once Nixon ended the gold standard, put the final nail in that coffin, you know, what happened was inflation started escalating out of control. And the whole goal of government, largely at that point, a huge part of their goal was to prevent the people from really seeing that. And I'll give you an example. Lyndon Johnson, who preceded Nixon and was in an inflationary mess of his own because he had printed out more papers than we had gold. The price of eggs was rising under his presidency, and at the time he was considering running for re-election, but he knew how upset people were about the rise in the price of eggs, so he ordered a Surgeon General to put out a phony press release that stated eggs were horrible for people to eat. So the demand for eggs went down, the supply remained the same, but what you saw is the price come down due to the decrease in demand, and it worked. The price of eggs came down, people relaxed. If you look at what happened in Sri Lanka just in 2022, there were food riots and they overthrew the government. That was over rising food prices. And just in the past 10 years, there's been thousands of food riots, mainly in Europe, over the rising costs of food. So it's this constant battle and this chase where, you know, the government wants to stay in power like everybody does. This isn't some conspiracy in terms of motive. I mean, the government and political leaders from both sides of the aisle of all countries want to stay in power. And it seems like the American people have a really high toleration for war and scandal. But what we don't tolerate is the rising price of food. So instead of trying to deal with the issue of the rising price, what they've done is, and I've documented this in the book, like I think pretty meticulously, they've gone on a campaign to alter the food supply. And this kind of brings us back to Earl Butts. He was at the beginning of this, and he gave an interview where he was talking about how, you know, people buy a sofa once every 10 years, but they have to go to the grocery store at least once a week. And this is a big deal. So he told small farmers, we had a very diverse farming landscape at that point, go big or go home. And he geared the fiat money printer, which again, it's like this huge weapon because it removes opportunity cost from money. Whereas if there was a gold standard and somebody like Earl Butts wanted to channel trillions of dollars or billions of dollars into corn, soy, or sugar, you'd have to get the consent of the people because they'd want to know where their gold was going, how this was working. They don't have to ask anybody's permission if they're going to send $40 million of subsidies to corn in 1973. They can just do it. And it alters and shifts the entire food landscape. Before you know it, you fast forward a few years, almost every ingredient in the grocery store, especially in the middle aisles, is made out of corn, soy lecithin, sugar. And if you're eating only those things, you don't really notice the rising price of food. You don't notice inflation. Where do you notice it? You notice it in meat because you can't print a cow. You can print a Dorito, but you have to, cows are, you know, ask a farmer. I mean, cows, you have to raise them, you have to butcher them, you have to preserve their meat. They're not, also the profit isn't as high. So while the profit point on a Snicker bar is incredibly high, profit point on a steak is low. Like the farmers are not making a lot of money on beef right now.
Hmm.
So it's been this 50-year, give and take between the government and the food supply of trying to obscure the rising cost of food. And I think they've been remarkably successful, to the detriment of the American public's health, of course. But for them, if you go and you order a steak now, you're more likely to get eye rolls and possibly sort of a lecture than if you order, a Mountain Dew Red Alert and Tasty Cakes.
Right.